Huh.
Have you ever felt bad about playing a video game? I don't mean like a guilty pleasure kind of game. I mean like the kind of game that made you feel genuinely remorseful. The kind of game that forced you down the path of darkness. The kind of game that made you want to stop playing as if to save all of the characters in it. I'm sure you've played a few. Spec Ops, The Walking Dead, even a couple we've talked about qualify, like Chrono Trigger or Snake Eater. Some of these games may offer you choices or ways out of the dark side, but the game we're talking about today forces you down that path, and all of the guilt that comes with it. This is a game where the devil literally tells you a half-truth and makes you commit genocide. That's pretty evil. But Shadow of the Colossus does an admirable job of keeping you absolved of any sin. Well, up until the end anyway. Then it piles it back on, because this is a game all about sin and atonement.
The story of Shadow of the Colossus is as classic and simple as they come. A hero journeys to the mystical land of danger in order to rescue his one true love. It's a timeless setup right out of Wagner or the Brothers Grimm. Our hero, named Wander, comes to this forbidden land with his possibly dead love in tow in order to revive her with a magic spell. Think of how many Disney movies you've seen with that concept. I can think of like 5, maybe more. In fact, play this game and see if you can count how many fairy tale or mythological tropes you can find. You have the hero having to pass through a gauntlet of tests and challenges in order to prove his love. There's a comatose woman spending most of the time on her back, reinforcing outdated gender roles from the Middle Ages. There's the small, courageous warrior taking on the big brute. And of course, there's a deal with the devil.
The clues that Dorman may not be as benevolent as he seems are pretty subtle at first. The land has been forbidden, and Dorman's demands seem pretty practical. But it is a pretty fair proposition. Take down the monsters and you get your girlfriend back. Definitely not talking a purely loving god, but at least chaotic neutral, you know?
He seems like less of a Satan and more like the witch from Brave or something. Pragmatic and greedy, to be sure, but definitely able and willing to help out some poor soul like you. And that's the setup for the entire game. Every time you kill a Colossus, you return to your beloved's body, as if to remind you what's at stake.
But of course, there is evil at work behind the scenes.
Every time our hero gets stabbed by these weird tentacles and immediately sent back to get briefed on the next Colossus, you notice little things wrong. Like how the protagonist's face starts getting more and more screwed up as you kill more and more Colossi. Like Snake Eater, Shadow of the Colossus is a tragedy, but unlike Snake Eater, it doesn't bother trying to hide it. It makes it very clear that our hero is paying a dear price for his partner's life. By framing it as an awesome action game with thrilling boss fights, it makes sure that the player and protagonist alike are going to make it to the tragic end. But unlike Snake Eater, which made great strides to set up a camp-fueled judo throw, Shadow of the Colossus makes it clear to the player several times that this story probably isn't going to have a happy ending. But players have 3 reasons to keep playing, even with the knowledge that this game will likely end in tragedy. We'll get to 2 of those reasons in a little bit, but the third is the girl that lies on the altar. If at any point the player quits the game and never plays it again, she's never going to wake up.
They say that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. We know that our protagonist is madly, desperately in love with his maiden, and that he is willing to pay the ultimate price to save her life. And that he probably will. Like any other fairy tale, we're drawn to this protagonist and we have to see how his story ends, even if there is evil work behind the strings.
This isn't like Spec Ops or The Witcher, where the horrible actions that happen in the story are directly attributed to the player. In those games, the protagonists are widely open to interpretation. Yes, we know what kind of character Geralt of Rivia is, but he's still allowed to screw up because we, the players, could interpret him that way. Not so with Wander. Wander's main desire is immediately made clear in the first few moments of the game, and since the game is largely linear, there's little the player can do to really project themselves onto him. And it's not really through dialogue. Look at the way he walks or wields that legendary sword of his. Look at how he flies about when a Colossus tries to shake him off. This is even more apparent when you look at other, more modern climbing heroes like Ezio or Snake. He's an inexperienced wimp, guided only by sheer tenacity and love. Because of this, the player still feels guilt every time a Colossus falls to the ground, but it's somewhat offset by the desire to see Wander's story come to an end. As we mentioned earlier, though, that isn't the only reason players push on to see the game through. Let's talk about another big, obvious reason. It plays so well.
Now, let's not confuse that with fun. The Colossus fights are not fun. They are tense, they are harrowing, and they are very engaging, but they are not fun. It's hard to put that idea into words, really, so let's make a quick comparison.
Let's use 2001: A Space Odyssey. That is an awe-inspiring and huge movie with lots of interesting ideas, but it's not explicitly fun. Shadow of the Colossus is the same way. The first time you see a Colossus slowly trudging forward, it looks like a scary uphill fight, especially if this is your first time through. I mean, the box and promo art said they'd be colossal, but not this much. It shakes the earth with every step, rocking the camera and the DualShock alike. It towers over you like a skyscraper. Trying to bring that one down, let alone 15 more, is an intimidating proposition. While the fights seem imposing, the process for each of them is the same. Crawl over their body, find their weak point, and strike with your sword. The first Colossus is a good first test of that. It's covered with fur and easy enough to climb onto, but it still tries to shake you off. And if your grip gauge runs out, you'll have to start climbing all over again. In any other game, that would cripple the experience. Climbing each Colossus is a puzzle, and it's easy to lose engagement when you have to solve the same puzzle over and over again to get back on a Colossus's body. But here, it adds tension. When you're soaring through the air holding on for dear life, a lowering grip gauge keeps your hands glued to the controller. Half of these fights is knowing when to grab on and strike, and when to try and find a safe spot to rest and refill the gauge. It adds strategy and depth to a fight that already focuses on puzzle solving. And speaking of that, it's incredible the variety that they can fit into this game using the formula of getting onto their body, finding the weak point, and striking. Some of the bosses are as simple as shooting them to get their attention and jumping on. Sometimes you have to shoot a weak point and climb on while it's stunned. A couple of them are super elaborate. This one plays like a dangerous, tense game of the floor is lava as you try and lure the Colossus to a specific area. Often, manipulating the environment is just as important as manipulating the Colossus itself.
See, these battles engage your brain in spatial and strategic ways, but again, they're not fun. They are harrowing, distressing battles that take place at high speeds, sometimes several thousand feet in the air. They are desperate struggles against imposing opposition.
Even the smaller Colossi are a threat. Often, those ones are the most dangerous of all. They're fast and unpredictable, and they force you to think more about the environment rather than how to get directly on them. This Colossus looks tiny, but it's still a super scary fight, like you're fighting a lion or something. These fights can easily last upwards of an hour. Even if some of the Colossi themselves aren't too big, the battles themselves feel big. Which is why it's so important that fighting the Colossi is only half the real experience in Shadow of the Colossus. Well, okay, it's the only real part that's a challenge, but it's not just one grand fight after another. In order to fight the Colossi, you have to find them first. And that's where the third reason to see this game to the end comes in: the world. Between every fight, you have to hop on your horse and go find the next one. The game gives you a general direction, but often you have to find your own way through. And I think that design-wise, this move is ingenious. As I mentioned, the boss fights are intense and stressful, and if that was the only part of the game, it would tire out the player. Instead, after every fight, you're asked to sit on your horse and take a moment. Breathe the world in. Calm down and prepare yourself for the next fight. While navigating this world can sometimes be frustrating, I think it's absolutely vital to the overall experience. They complement the boss fights by allowing the player to contemplate on the narrative, the colossi, or their own actions. They ask the player to reflect on their previous feats. There's no dungeons or towns or anything in this overworld, but it's far from barren. You're the only living human for miles and miles, and the only other living threats to you in this world are the colossi. And even then, some of them don't attack until provoked. You could call it lonely, but the introvert inside me likes to think of it as a peaceful break from the chaos in the rest of the game. Actually, I take it back. You do have one companion. Agro, your horse. She doesn't speak, but there are little touches to make her more like a character than she really is.
The game world in Shadow of the Colossus is absolutely massive. It has to be, or else it wouldn't match the crazy scale of the boss fights. But while other games would give you like a fast travel method or a map, this game gives you a horse. And it's not just any horse.
Agro is difficult to control. She sometimes disobeys your directions and goes off somewhere else. She reacts to danger and keeps you away from ledges automatically. And yes, you could see that as a design flaw, but look at how many people see Agro as her own character. Think of how you reacted when Agro sacrificed herself at the end so you could fight the last Colossus. I'm willing to bet it was pretty tearful, right? It certainly was on my end. If Agro was a straight mechanical vehicle, a simple means to get from point A to point B, I don't think she would have had that kind of impact at the end. Because she kind of acts on her own and controls weirdly, you kind of grow attached to her. And when you lose her, well, it's certainly not a happy moment. Enhancing that effect is the emptiness of the world. There's no music, no enemies, no villagers, nothing. Just you, a horse, and a Colossus to go kill. You could spend hours just exploring everything. There are incentives and hidden objects that increase your health bar and grip gauge and whatnot, but those aren't really that important. You could beat the game exactly as you start it stat-wise. No, the incentive is in the landscapes, the forests, the deserts, the ruins. I'm going to tell you a little anecdote. Every time I play this game, I make a promise to myself to try and explore one area of the world that I hadn't before. This time, when I recorded gameplay for the video, it was to the east of this massive valley, preceding the final boss. Every time I'd beaten the game before, I'd look down that path and wonder a little bit, but because of the haste of the final encounter, I hadn't checked it out. This time, I moseyed on over. There was a fruit tree, but that wasn't really important. What was important was the view. I looked out as if to say goodbye to the game's world before I had beaten the game yet another time, and turned around, and there was a save point. There's nothing really here. There's no reason for a save point to be here, but it's there anyway, just in case you want to head out and take a look at the ocean at any point in the game. Its only purpose is an acknowledgement from the developers that yes, it's fine to take a look at the ocean before you finish the game. I love that so much. It's a little nod to the player's desire to explore this world, to contemplate and reflect on the game in between encounters. Our hero has made a serious commitment in this game. You know that the price he's paying to bring back his love is huge and terrible. You know that defeating these colossi is wrong, and that there's no way this story is going to end happily. These are things that are constantly running through the player's mind as they ride from Colossus to Colossus. And yet, the ending isn't absolutely tragic. It's very ambiguous and up to interpretation. But after hours and hours of seeing Wander turn into more and more of a monster, you'd expect a more horrific ending than this. But no. His maiden wakes up, as healthy as she was before the game's events. His horse makes it out of that nasty fall okay. The demon who's slowly been possessing Wander over the course of the game is banished and sealed. The guys who have been chasing Wander to the Forbidden Land leave peacefully. And Wander, is he alive? Dead? Reincarnated? We're not sure. It's an oddly optimistic ending to a story that is overwhelmingly tragic and stressful. The characters find a secret garden at the top of the temple, and you kind of get the sense that everything's going to be okay. What?
Players have been formulating theories about this ending for years and years now. It's wide open to player elucidation, kind of like Dark Souls. I have my own theory about how this game draws to a close.
As Lord Emon and his men are leaving the Forbidden Land, Emon says that he hopes Wander can find atonement for his sins. And let's face it, Wander has sinned a great deal in this game. He stole a legendary sword, he made a forbidden pact with the devil, he murdered 16 innocent Colossi, and most of all, he wanted to bring someone back from the dead. If you've ever read a fantasy or sci-fi novel about reanimation, you know that's a real bad idea. But what happens to him at the end? The demon within him is sealed away, and all that's left in the temple's pool is this baby. A lot of people like to speculate about how this connects to Eco, the other game by this game's developers, but I don't think that's relevant. I think this baby is actually Wander, and that he's being given a second chance to live a peaceful life with his love and his horse, free of strife in this plentiful garden. Of course, his sinful actions have changed the world irreparably. The beautiful, awe-inspiring colossi that once roamed these lands are now extinct. This forbidden land is now cut off from the outside world, and he can never see his own people again. He and his descendants will be forever regarded as outcasts. And yet, there's still hope for this man. Still a chance to make his love happy, and to make this forbidden land a little bit better.
Hebrews 9:12. Neither by the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood, he entered in once into the holy place, having obtained eternal redemption. It's proof that even the darkest clouds can have a silver lining. That's the kind of beautiful, almost biblical message this game makes. Shadow of the Colossus is a tragedy, but it's not the same kind of tragedy as Snake Eater. In Snake Eater, the player was bound to a start of darkness, but in Shadow of the Colossus, this tragedy is the beginning of hope. Our hero is absolved of sin, and he's ready to begin life anew. This game isn't mechanically perfect, but the fact that it introduces such a wonderful and thoughtful message through its minimalist design, well, that's something that really impresses me. It's the message that even though you've done terrible things, the world will welcome you back. It's not going to forget what you did, but it will still welcome you back with open arms. It's kind of an almost warm message that stands alone in video gaming today. And if that's the kind of beautiful statement that brings a tear to your eye, then that's fine. That's what it does for me. Because sometimes, even though we've committed heinous acts and survived harsh times, we need to understand that at the end, everything's going to be okay.